On the 6th of October, 1777, roughly 900 British soldiers walked 7 miles over a mountain in order to defeat a chain. They could not sail through it. They would not sail at it. Downriver sat the warships of the most powerful navy on Earth, and not one captain among them was willing to put a bow against the thing. You will see that chain described as 4 tons. The figure circulates widely. It is in the title of this episode, and it is not close. The barrier at Fort Montgomery ran roughly 600 yards, bank to bank. It was built from something in the region of 850 links. Each link weighed about 60 pounds. Do that multiplication and you get 35 tons of iron floating on the surface of a tidal river. 4 tons would have been decorative. 4 tons is a heavy anchor cable. 4 tons would have been torn apart by the Hudson itself long before a British bow ever reached it. And the men who built this thing knew that because the first version of their chain had already snapped under nothing but moving water. What follows is the story of a weapon that was never fired, never struck, and never tested, and which may have decided the war anyway. To understand why anyone would sink an industrial fortune into iron and drop it in a river, stop thinking of the Hudson as scenery and start thinking of it as infrastructure. In 1777, there were no roads capable of moving an army north through the interior at speed. There was the river. It carried ocean-going vessels far inland. It linked at its northern end to the lakes running toward Canada, and at its southern end it emptied into a harbor the British had held since 1776. A fleet that could sail the Hudson freely could move troops, guns, powder, and provisions up the spine of the continent faster than any marching column. That was British grand strategy in a sentence. Take the river, and New England, the hard core of the rebellion, the source of its money, its shipping, and its most committed manpower, would be cut off from everything south of it. 2 smaller rebellions are far easier to fight than 1 large one. The American problem was that they had no answer at sea. The Continental Navy could not face a British ship of the line in open water, and both sides understood it. When you cannot beat a fleet, you have 2 remaining options: deny it the water or make the water expensive. Geography offered one place to try. North of where the Bear Mountain Bridge stands today, the river squeezes between mountains and narrows to something around 600 yards. The banks rise steeply enough to mount guns above a ship's ability to elevate its own. A sailing vessel entering that stretch loses its room to maneuver exactly where it becomes most exposed. The idea of stringing something across that gap was old. As early as June of 1775, General James Clinton and Christopher Tappan had suggested to the New York authorities that booms chained together might be drawn across the channel. Terrain does not win wars. It decides where they are fought. The chain was not the first attempt. It was what they arrived at after the cheaper ideas failed. The first approach used chevaux de frise, heavy timber frames, iron-tipped and angled upward, deliberately sunk in the channel to gut the hull of anything that sailed over them. In 1776, a line of them went into the water between Fort Washington on Upper Manhattan and Fort Lee on the Jersey shore, drawing on schemes put forward by Robert Erskine, the Scottish-born ironmaster who would later serve as Washington's Surveyor General. The design carried a flaw that had nothing to do with engineering. A barrier meant to stop enemy ships must also let friendly ones through, which means leaving a gap, which means that gap becomes the most valuable secret on the river. Someone local gave it away. British vessels found the safe channel, and by the middle of November 1776, both forts had fallen, making the whole obstruction pointless. A second line was begun further north, between Plum Point and Polypal Island, the island where Bannerman's Castle stands today. There, the river beat them without any help from informers. Too deep, too wide, and too energetic for frames that had to sit on the bottom and stay where they were put. The work was abandoned. A submerged obstacle only works where the water is shallow enough to reach and calm enough to leave it alone. The Highlands offered neither, so the Americans went to the surface and to iron. The man handed the problem had invented most of his own biography. Thomas Machine told the Continental establishment that he was the son of John Machine, the mathematician and secretary of the Royal Society. He said he had come over in 1772 to survey a New Jersey copper mine for British investors. He said he had joined the Sons of Liberty in Boston, thrown tea into the harbor, helped lay out the defenses at Bunker Hill, and taken a wound in the battle. British muster rolls tell a different story, and a far more dangerous one. Machine enlisted in the 23rd Regiment of Foot on the 17th of February, 1773, as the regiment prepared to ship for America. It sailed that April and reached New York in June. By the summer of 1775, the regiment was at Boston, and on the 28th of July, standing sentry on a fireboat, Machine took a canoe and another man's firelock and disappeared. He was a deserter. He then presented himself to George Washington and swore allegiance to the cause he had been sent across an ocean to suppress. 2 British officers thought the loss worth writing down, which by itself tells you something. Lieutenant Richard Williams of his own regiment recorded that the missing man was a pretty good mechanic and knew a little of fortification, adding that he had invented a new pivoting carriage for guns. But here is the part the fabrication was hiding, and it is better than the fabrication. Machine was born in Staffordshire in 1744, and in his youth he was apprenticed to James Brindley, the most celebrated canal engineer in England, the man who built the Bridgewater Canal and effectively invented the British canal system. Machine had spent his formative years learning how to make water go where you want it to go. That is not a decorative detail. It is the whole reason he was equal to the problem. Damming, embanking, sluicing, calculating what a moving body of water will do to a structure placed in its path. This was his trade before he ever put on a red coat. Washington, who had every reason to be cautious, called him an ingenious man, said he gave great satisfaction as an engineer, and placed him over the Highland defenses alongside Colonel James Clinton. The lie was social. Canal apprentices were tradesmen. Sons of Royal Society fellows were gentlemen, and the Continental Officer Corps was full of gentlemen. Machine appears to have decided which story would get him listened to, and told that one instead. Underneath the invented pedigree was a rebellion that could not field a trained engineer of its own, handing the most technically demanding project on the continent to a man who had been in the enemy's ranks 2 years earlier. Desperation is a form of open-mindedness. It has a poor reputation and a surprisingly good record. In July of 1776, a committee sitting at Poughkeepsie worked through the candidate sites. Philip Schuyler argued for a shallow spot called Cantan Hook. The committee chose the lower gate of the Highlands instead, running the barrier from Fort Montgomery on the west bank across to the rock face called Anthony's Nose on the east. Accounts of the span vary between roughly 1,700 and 1,800 feet, over a channel that dropped away to something like 150 feet of black water beneath the links. The links were forged from wrought iron bar, 1.5 to 2 inches square, heated, bent, and hammer welded closed. 18 to 24 inches long apiece, around 60 pounds each, something close to 850 of them. Iron does not float. That was the entire engineering problem, and the answer was timber. pine logs, 2 feet through, cut to 16 feet, were waterproofed and lashed 4 abreast with cross timbers into rafts. The chain rode on top in sections of 10 links, each section ending in a swivel and a clevis, a U-shaped fitting closed by a heavy bolt, so lengths could be joined out on the water without a forge. The swivels are the detail worth pausing on because they show a man thinking about forces rather than objects. Set at intervals matching the raft spacing, they let each section rotate independently. A rising tide lifting one raft while its neighbor dropped would otherwise wind the chain along its own axis, and a chain under tension that is also being twisted will fail at a weld long before it fails in tension. An obstacle in moving water is not a static object. It is a structure under continuous reversing 3-dimensional load. It must be designed to move or it will be designed to break. The canal apprentice understood that. He still got it wrong the first time. The chain went in around the 1st of November, 1776, laid straight across the current, bank to bank, on the shortest possible line. The Hudson, there is not really a river at all. It is a tidal estuary, reversing twice a day with the weight of the Atlantic behind it. It broke. Senior officers stood on the bank and watched the Continental Congress's money fail in front of them. The error was geometric. A barrier set square to a current presents the largest possible surface to it and absorbs the maximum possible energy. Machines spent the winter repairing links, which cost nothing in security because ice closed the river to the Royal Navy for free. When the chain went back across in the spring of 1777, he had set it at a steep angle to the flow. Water now slid along the line instead of piling against it, and the load came down far enough for the iron to hold. Cables were meant to be strung ahead of it as a boom to bleed the momentum out of any ship that came in fast, with capstans ashore to take up slack. That was the plan. The plan required cable. The chain was never meant to work alone. Guns at Fort Montgomery, north of Popolopan Creek, and Fort Clinton on the south side covered the water between them, and a small squadron lay above the barrier to stop anyone approaching it with saws and hammers. 2 of those vessels were supposed to be the pride of the river. In December of 1775, Congress had authorized 13 frigates, and 2 were laid down at Poughkeepsie. The Congress, rated at 28 guns, under Captain Thomas Grinnell, and the Montgomery, rated at 24, under Captain John Hodge. They were late, and they were underfed. Congress wanted them launched by March of 1776. Shortages, work stoppages, and the diversion of naval stores north to Benedict Arnold's improvised fleet on Lake Champlain pushed the launch to November. Neither ship ever received her full armament. The Montgomery mounted 8 12-pounders on a hull built for 3 times that number. Then came the decision that killed her. In July of 1777, with the boom still unbuilt because nobody could find spars heavy enough, Governor George Clinton ordered the Montgomery's crew to splice 3 of the frigate's own anchor cables together and hang them across the river in front of the chain. Read that again slowly. To protect the chain, they took a warship's ground tackle, the gear by which a sailing vessel holds position against a current, and dismantled it in a tidal estuary. On a ship crewed largely by soldiers and boys. They understood the trade and made it anyway, because a chain that fails is a catastrophe, while a frigate that cannot anchor is merely a risk. It is exactly the sort of decision that looks reasonable in July and unforgivable in October. One quick note before we go on, we're now also live on Spotify, so if you'd rather listen to these episodes than watch them, the whole series is there. Now, back to the river. By the autumn of 1777, the chain had stopped being an engineering story and become a strategic one. John Burgoyne had come down from Canada with an army and was now stuck near Saratoga, short of food, his supply line stretched past breaking, his native allies drifting away. The army that was supposed to meet him at Albany had gone to Philadelphia instead, because William Howe had chosen a different campaign. Whatever relief was coming would have to come up the Hudson from New York, where Sir Henry Clinton commanded a modest garrison and had never been promised enough men to do the job. Clinton looked at the Highlands and did precisely the arithmetic Machine had been counting on him doing. Forcing the barrier meant sailing wooden ships into a 600-yard gap under plunging fire from two forts, past armed vessels, and then holding position, stationary in a current under guns, while working parties tried to cut 35 tons of iron. A ship stopped dead beneath artillery is not a warship. It is a target with a crew inside it. He decided not to try. Hold on to that, because it is the whole point of the episode. The chain achieved its purpose inside the mind of an enemy commander who never came within sight of it. A barrier does not have to be unbreakable. It only has to be expensive enough that a rational opponent picks the other option, and then you find out what the other option costs him. The other option was a mountain. On the 5th of October, Clinton moved his force up the east bank to Verplancks Point, which looked exactly like the opening of an attack on Israel Putnam's troops there. Sir James Wallace took a galley squadron upriver, the Crane, the Dependence, and the Spitfire among them, and screened Peekskill Neck, cutting the Americans' ability to see across their own river. It was a feint, and it worked because it was aimed at a fear the Americans already had. Putnam shifted his weight east. The forts were now on their own. Fog came down at daybreak on the 6th. Under it, Clinton ferried around 2,100 men back across to Stony Point, several miles below the forts, and split them in two. The advance guard, about 900 men, drawn from the 52nd and 57th Regiments with Hessian chasseurs and roughly 400 provincials, went the hard way under Lieutenant Colonel Mungo Campbell, a 7-mile detour around the gorge and over the pass at Dunderberg to come out behind Fort Montgomery. Their guide was Colonel Beverly Robinson of the Loyal American Regiment, a local man who knew the ground because he had lived on it. The single most valuable asset in the entire operation was a neighbor. The remaining 1,200, under Major General John Vaughan, moved on Fort Clinton, Grenadier and Light Infantry companies, the 26th and 63rd Regiments, a detachment of the 71st, dismounted dragoons, and Hessian Grenadiers and Jaegers. They waited at Doodletown to give Campbell time to complete the longer march so that both attacks could go in together. The terrain imposed one enormous condition: no artillery. Guns could not be dragged over Dunderberg. Whatever happened at the forts would be settled with bayonets. Inside the forts were somewhere between 600 and 700 men, militia and Continentals, with Fort Montgomery under Governor George Clinton and Fort Clinton under his brother James. They were outnumbered roughly 3-1, but that was not their real problem. They were facing the wrong way. Fortifications are built against the direction the threat is expected from. Their guns pointed at the water. Their strength was the water side. The landward redoubts were too widely spaced for the garrison to man properly, and a good many of the rank and file had no bayonets at all. Every hour those columns spent climbing was an hour the defenders spent watching a river where nothing was going to happen. Sometime after 4 in the afternoon, both British columns were in position behind the works. Before the final assault, Campbell sent forward a flag of truce, offering terms and asking the garrison to spare any further effusion of blood. George Clinton sent Lieutenant Colonel William Livingston out to meet it. Livingston listened to the demand for surrender, then invited the British to surrender instead, and promised them good treatment. It was audacity from a man holding a fort with no bayonets and no reinforcements coming. The parley ended. The assault went in. The approach to Fort Clinton ran hundreds of yards through abatis. Felled trees, interlocked with their sharpened branches, turned outward, swept by American guns firing from a raised battery. Daylight was going. The men attacking there were ordered forward without firing a shot. They walked into that fire and kept walking. Loading and firing means stopping, and stopping in the open under grape shot is what kills you. It is a brutally clear-headed piece of tactics, and it demands a level of discipline most armies in history could not have supplied. At Fort Montgomery, Campbell was killed leading his own advance guard onto the North Redoubt. Robinson, the neighbor, took over, and the attack did not slow. Vaughn had his horse shot from under him going in at Fort Clinton. Both forts fell that evening after fighting inside the works, hand to hand, in failing light and then in darkness. What followed the breach was ugly. Several accounts describe men cut down after resistance had effectively ended. Governor Clinton got out into the woods and away. So did Thomas Machine, badly wounded while serving a heavy gun. The engineer who designed the chain was hit trying to defend it with cannon fire. British returns give 41 killed, 142 wounded, and 5 missing. American losses ran to roughly 75 killed and wounded, with 263 taken prisoner, 26 officers, and 237 enlisted men. The garrison had lost close to half its strength. When the shore batteries changed hands, the naval position above the chain became indefensible within minutes. Wallace's galleys had already worked upriver. The Dependence alone is recorded as putting 95 24-pound shot and 6 4-pounders into the forts and the shipping, while heavier vessels crowded sail to come up in support. The Congress had been sent north the previous day to get clear and had run aground on the flats. The Montgomery had no anchors because her anchors were in the river, spliced into a boom. With the ebb running and the wind failing, she drifted down toward the very chain she had been stationed there to protect. That night, the Americans burned their own fleet. Hodge fired the Montgomery, and she lit the gorge from bank to bank. The next day, Lieutenant Daniel Shaw burned the stranded Congress near Fort Constitution. The galleys, Lady Washington and Shark, went the same way, and the sloop Camden with them. By morning, the British had uninterrupted access to the barrier and took it apart at their leisure. The British returns give the clearest measure of the loss. 67 guns taken at the forts, 6 of them 32-pounders, plus more than 30 aboard the burned ships. 1,150 stands of arms destroyed and 150 captured, 54 casks of powder, 57,396 musket cartridges, 9,530 round shot. The chain and boom together were reckoned to have cost the rebels 70,000 pounds. William Tryon burned the depot at Continental Village, barracks built for 1,500 men. Wallace pushed past the sunken obstructions at Polypal Island. And on the 16th of October, Vaughan put Kingston, then the seat of New York's new state government, to the torch, along with some 400 houses and barns. By every visible measure, the chain had been a total and very expensive failure. The next day, the 17th of October, Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga. Clinton's relief force never got near him. It had spent its autumn feinting, ferrying, climbing a mountain in fog, storming 2 forts by bayonet, and then dismantling 35 tons of iron by hand. By the time anything was moving freely up the Hudson, the army it was meant to save had run out of food and options. Be careful with the causation here, because this is where popular accounts overreach. Burgoyne was beaten by Horatio Gates, by his own collapsing supply line, by the militia that swelled around his flanks, and above all, by Howe's decision to march on Philadelphia rather than up the river. Sir Henry Clinton was never given the strength to save him and probably could not have done it in any case. No chain did that. But the barrier set the terms of the attempt. It converted a naval problem, solvable in days by a fleet that already existed, into an infantry problem solvable only in weeks. And Burgoyne did not have weeks. An obstacle's real product is not denial. It is time. And time is the one commodity in war that cannot be manufactured, requisitioned, or replaced. The Americans drew exactly that conclusion. Governor Clinton noted the thing that mattered most. The Royal Navy had never once tried to run the chain. The concept was sound. What had failed was everything protecting it. Through the winter, they argued about where to put the next one. The French engineer Louis de la Radière wanted the old ground at Popolopen Creek rebuilt. Clinton, Israel Putnam, and a recovering Thomas Machine wanted to go further north, to West Point, where the river makes a hard double bend. The logic was elegant. A square-rigged ship beating upriver against the current has to tack through that curve, losing way as it turns, and a ship that has lost way beneath cliffs is simply a stationary target. The second chain corrected every fault of the first. Peter Townsend's Sterling Iron Works took the contract on the 2nd of February, 1778, running 7 forging fires and 10 welding fires, and paid £440 for every ton delivered. The stock went up to 2.5 inches square. Links now weighed between 100 and 114 pounds apiece, close to double their predecessors. The commonly cited total is 65 tons, though estimates run to 75 or 80, and higher figures appear when anchors and hardware are counted, so treat any single number you see quoted with a degree of suspicion. It came roughly 32 miles by ox sledge over frozen passes to New Windsor and went across the river on the 30th of April, 1778. This time, a log boom sat downstream to absorb any ram before it reached the iron. Tadeusz Kosciuszko laid out the landward defenses at West Point so that no column could ever repeat the walk over Dunderberg. Every autumn, the whole barrier was hauled ashore before the ice came, and every spring it went back in, every year, until the war ended. The Royal Navy never tested it, not once. Even after Benedict Arnold handed over the plans of West Point and advised that the chain could be broken, no one tried. The chain at Fort Montgomery was captured, cut apart, and carried off to be melted down. It never stopped a ship. It never even touched one. But 900 men climbed a mountain in the dark to get around it, and the hours that cost them were hours an army 200 miles to the north did not have to spare. Barriers are not measured by what they stop. They are measured by what they force the other side to do instead. And the most successful obstacle of the American Revolution is the one that sat in the water for 5 years, cost a fortune, and was never touched at all.